Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast. I'm Jim Henson, Director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. Back 2 days after the election with Joshua Blank, Research Director of the Texas Politics Project, who's been a very busy man since the election.
Yeah, I guess so. I don't know. Sure.
That's humble. Well, it's done. At least the election part. So the 2022 election in Texas is now in the books. Obviously not quite in the books in several other places in the country. You know, an interesting election in the way that it was in some ways such a status quo election, you know, and you know, last week we talked a lot about how familiar this all looked based on the polling we had done. It started looking even more familiar during early voting, though we needed to be a little, you know,
humble, I like to say.
Well, humble and, careful,
Well, they go hand in hand sometimes.
Hopefully. Anybody listening to this will know basically, but yesterday afternoon, 100% of we're recording this on Thursday. Yesterday afternoon on Wednesday, Secretary of State published the final results. Abbott 54.8%, O'Rourke 43.81 for an 11-point margin, slightly over where the two major polling averages were. 538 and RCP. I think one was about 9.8. The other was in the low 10s, I think. Yeah,
which is, I think, that's a conversation for another day, but something that we should probably be pretty comfortable, at this point in time, expecting.
Yes.
For lots of reasons, anyway.
Right. And so, the polling averages, were pretty close, despite, some commentary, I guess we'll call it. The polling, was pretty in the ballpark this time. And in the ballpark, really in the infield.
It certainly seemed to track the contours of the election pretty broadly, as only a trial ballot can do. And, in the end, it seemed that, especially in the late stages as we move to likely voter samples and from, I think, the people who've been kind of doing this here for a little bit, it all kind of seemed to be around that range. So it certainly wasn't a super big surprise on Election Day, at least if you believe, that they were at least, making relatively accurate estimates of the sentiment of the electorate.
Right. And in terms of the competitiveness on the rest of the ballot, kind of that did not, the statewide ballot did not really materialize. Lieutenant Governor Patrick reached almost 54%, finished ahead of Mike Collier by about 10.5, a little more than 10.4 or so, 10.37, I guess. The Attorney General pulled another one out, so to speak, just about a few tenths of a point below the lieutenant governor.
Should put a pin and come back to that one.
Yes.
Wait for the end.
Won his race by just a smidge under 10.
Yeah, I mean, somebody pointed out the fact that, if you look at the top 3 Republican vote getters and the top 3 Democratic vote getters, pretty close.
Yeah.
It was,
pretty... Yeah, I mean, as we got down, farther down the ballot, we saw those gaps opening up a bit, but, there's no point in talking about what people's expectations were at this point, I don't think. And then we saw...
That's what we're luckily released from.
Right.
At this point, that's why it's nice the election is done.
So I think, and then, pretty close to the old numbers in the Texas legislature, something else that we had talked about in the last couple weeks. And that all seemed to be pretty on track. We were saying there were probably not more than, 5 or so competitive races. Turned out we had 5 flips, right? But for a net gain of 1 for the Republicans. Then, Phil King, former representative, now Senator Phil King, or actually, he's already been declared elected.
Right.
So
we'll come back to that too, maybe.
Yeah. Representative Phil King steps into the redrawn Beverly Powell seat in the Senate. So we have a 1912 Senate again, and a legislature that looks like it will be 86-64. I guess in the Senate we should flag there'll probably be a recount in the vacated seat of former Senator Lucio.
Yeah.
But the Democrat, Morgan Lamontia, has won that seat, I think by less than 2 points. There'll be a recount. But I think the general expectation is that will hold.
And just as an aside, if you are interested in that sort of thing, you can kind of like look around on the internet for analyses of how much recounts tend to shift votes, and they tend to be very, very, very minor shifts.
Right.
So a 2-point difference would be pretty far outside the range of what a typical recount would be expected to change in general. So it'd be unusual.
So, even less surprising than usual, I think. I mean, in the sense that, we always feel like, I think we said probably last week or the week before, there's very often, a surprise flip that everybody goes, oh, no one thought that way,
Right.
The races that flipped were on all the lists pretty much, or the seats that flipped were pretty much on all the lists. Turnout, moderate. My notes are saying moderate at best. I think that's probably unfair. I mean, between 24 and 2018, with 2018, as we've said on here, ad nauseum being a pretty unusually high year, we saw 45.68% turnout this year, 50 compared to 53 in 2018, which was very high.
Yeah.
So, about 8 million votes.
But I'd say, people are kind of, look, I've been a big, proponent of reminding people that Texas is a low voter turnout state.
Yeah.
And regardless of what election cycle we're in, whether it's high turnout generally or low turnout generally, Texas is usually at the bottom. Having said that, like compared to 2018, you'd say, voter turnout was moderate. It's at 45 versus 53. But if we look back at midterm election cycles, in 2014, this is of registered voters, about 34%. 2010, it was 38. 2006, it was about 34. So this is actually a pretty...
It was generally in the 30s.
Yeah, so this is actually...
most of the modern era.
It's regressed, to use a term that's many people's, I guess. It's regressed to the mean, but it hasn't gone back to sort of where it was before, the 2018 and 2020 cycles.
And I think, there's a discussion going on now nationally that Texas is relative to this discussion, given that and I haven't seen, we probably won't see I haven't seen a table of overall state turnouts, or I haven't looked at it yet. I think we're probably still going to be near the bottom of the pack based on what I've seen in other parts of the country.
And just what we've seen historically.
Yeah.
I mean, just historically, that's been the case. And there's no reason to think that would shift in one election cycle. And there's no reason to think based on what happened here, that would be the year.
Yeah, given what we've seen and, what these margins were, et cetera.
Right.
I mean, so, the big takeaways, the big overarching takeaway is, Texas is still getting more competitive, and you can dig into those numbers in a sec. So, on one hand, by most measures that we could look at, yes, but on the other hand, very gradually, and I think, from a partisan point of view in the aftermath, we're seeing people, leaning on different ends of that argument, right? It's getting better. On the other hand, okay, fine.
It's surprisingly quiet from both sides, actually. I mean, there are people pushing arguments out, but it's not as though, I wouldn't say, there's clearly not a lot of Republicans right now crowing about how great the election went in a lot of places.
Yeah.
Texas is a little bit more than other places, but that sort of seems to be kind of drowned out by the national discussion, the fact that we are.
Yeah, I think that's, and there's, I think there's a certain degree of exhaustion here.
Yeah.
That.
Not talking for ourselves.
And when you get when you have such a big run up and then you have an outcome that looks in retrospect predictable, people take a break, my experience, people take a break for a few days.
Yeah.
And, we even, we delayed the podcast in some ways for that. But so, what sticks out to you on this? Let's talk about the geography of this. We talked about a lot of the geography of this going in. We should look at that again and kind of see what we found out when you looked at those numbers.
Yeah, it's interesting because, you're right. I think, on election night, you're looking at the numbers and you're saying, well, this seems to be pretty predictable based on what we knew and based on the election environment and the issue environment and all those things, right? But I was thinking about this, in this sort of hypothetical way that, if somebody had told me, 6 months ago and said, look, forget about the issue environment, forget about the dynamics.
All the things we were talking about.
All the things we're talking about. But this is the thing about that makes, I think, just as an aside, this is one of those things that I think makes interpreting and understanding election outcomes so difficult, is people pick the things that they want to say were important or hinged, or the election hinged on or whatever. And that's almost always in a self-interested way. And the reality is a lot of things mattered. So what we're doing right now is we're going to hold those other things constant for a second so we can focus on geography for a second. And I think, if you'd said to me, okay, set all that stuff aside, Republicans win by 11 points, what do you think probably happened? Or what are some of the things that you would think happened? And, in addition to kind of the obvious, well, I think independents probably broke, back towards Republicans from breaking for Democrats. Geographically, I would say, we've been talking about electoral gains by Democrats in the urban areas and the suburban areas. And, I'd probably think maybe some of those trends abated, or maybe, we saw Democrats performing less well in those areas. And the interesting thing is that's not exactly what we see here. Now, I should just set this up a little bit for completeness, just tell you what data I'm looking at.
Yeah.
And why I'm choosing to look at some versions of this data or some specific numbers. So what I'm looking at is I'm taking the election results by county from the Texas Secretary of State's website, their beautiful website. I'm copying and pasting that table from there, and I am cleaning up that data, and then I'm combining it with there's sort of a bulk data file on the I think it's on the redistricting website or texas.data.gov. If someone really wants to know, please email me and I will tell you exactly where it is. But you can get a bulk data file with all the election results by precinct going back for a ways. And that's what I'm using for the prior election. So that's the baked data for looking at other elections. So what elections should we look at? Number one, we shouldn't look at 2020 as a presidential election. That's silly. So let's look at some midterms. So I'm looking at 2022, 2018, and 2014 election results. And then the question becomes this question, what should you compare within here? Well, if we want to compare Beto O'Rourke's performance, this week to how he did against Ted Cruz in 2018, obviously he did not do as well, right? I mean, as a percentage, he did not do as well. And in terms of raw vote totals, he didn't do as well. Again, we already talked about turnout was down. He wasn't going to hit those votes. If we look at Abbott's performance against Lupe Valdez in that same election, he also performed worse in most cases. He got less votes. Good. Turnout was down. So both of them necessarily did not have wouldn't say had a great evening relative to their most recent election. Okay. So that's, so then the question is, how should we compare this? Well, I think the difficult part is 2018 was such an odd year because of the increased turnout, because of the fact that, number one, there's a Republican in the White House. It was Donald Trump. That motivated a lot of Democratic voters. 2014 is probably a more comparable election, both in terms of kind of the turnout rate, the fact that you had a Democrat in the White House, it was a midterm election with Democrats, and you had a funded Democratic candidate. I mean, the other thing about the whole Lupe Valdez race is, she was underwhelming in terms of her campaign, but also in terms of her resources.
Yeah, very under-resourced.
Wendy Davis wasn't under-resourced, and anyone would say, yeah, but the Dobbs decision and abortion, it's like, yeah, abortion was part of the mix in 2014, very much so in Texas. Right. So this is probably a little bit more comparable. So then I would say, further analysis needs to bring in a little bit of voter turnout and the size of these sort of geographies to sort of add a little more context to this. I haven't had a chance to do this yet. So what I want to look at is the percentages. Basically say, how does sentiment look in these different parts of the state? Okay. So overall, as you already said, Abbott got about 55% of the vote. O'Rourke got about 48%. And again, we say this is actually, in gubernatorial contests, more competitive. Abbott got 59% of the vote in 2014. He got about 56% of the vote in 2018. We say he's down to, 55. Not great. It's pretty much the same. O'Rourke for the Democrat, Wendy Davis got 38.9% in 2014. Lupe Valdez got 42.51, and he only got up to 43.8. Now, again, I'll point out very different environments. We've talked about this before, but Lupe Valdez had all the wind at her back in that environment, and kind of wasn't able to capitalize on it, certainly. O'Rourke in this environment obviously had a lot more wind at his front. But then if we go and you like that wind at his front? I don't even know. That's not a saying.
I think you flipped those. I think she had wind in her face, and she
had wind in her back, and he had wind in his face.
Yeah, wind in his front, though, is okay.
Okay. Wind. He had the winds. But then if we start to kind of look into the geographies, we say, okay, so what happened in the big counties, in Harris, Dallas, Tarrant, Bexar, and Travis County? And I'm partially why am I picking those and not adding El Paso, which people sometimes do? I'm looking at the places that contribute the most to the vote.
Right.
So combine these together, we're talking about 40 to 50% of the statewide vote. It's the big urban counties. Okay, so what do we have here? Not surprisingly, O'Rourke wins this by basically 58-41. But the other thing that's kind of interesting here is this is actually a significantly better performance percentage-wise than even in 2018 or 2014. So in 2014, Democrats got basically just under 50% of the vote in these counties. In 2018, they got 54%, and now it's 58%. So each election, they've added 4% of the vote. Abbott in each of those four elections went from 48.4% of the vote in 2014 to 44.12% in 2018 to just under 41% in 2022. So in the urban areas, actually, we're still seeing Democrats picking up vote share in these large counties. Now, again, you can look in each of the counties. I don't want to talk about each of them. They kind of tell a similar story. I'll just point out Dallas is a really interesting one because actually, this is a place where it really jumped. In 2014, Abbott got 44% of the vote. In 2018, he got 39, and in 2022, he got 36. So Democrats went from 55% of the vote in Dallas County in 2014 to 63% in 2022. I think it's a pretty big jump and gives you an example. Tarrant County gets a lot of attention. It's the one county that Abbott won, the one large county.
One of these, yeah, right.
Right. But I mean, the reality is, when people are talking about, these counties, and Tarrant County, they're talking about Biden won it and O'Rourke won it over Cruz. But Abbott has won this county in each of the last 3 elections in the gubernatorial race. He won with 57% of the vote in 2014, 54% of the vote in 2018, and 51% this election. So again, it's the same story, even in a large county that Republicans do well in. So then we can go into what about the suburbs? You and I talked a lot about the suburbs in this election, and I think it was a big focus. Now here, what we find, and just as an aside, what the definitions I'm using in this case, usually the suburbs are usually the counties that are surrounding the large urban counties.
Right.
is basically the definition here. And I can, again, if anybody's interested, email me. I'll send you the list of the counties I'm talking about. I'm happy to. So if we look here, Abbott wins in 2022, these suburban counties, 60% to 38%, pretty comfortable margin, right? Certainly, I think for Democrats to be competitive here, they really need to close that into much more of a almost even range.
Yeah. And that's not too far off what we were getting in the polling.
No. But again, in 2014, Abbott got 67% in these counties, and Wendy Davis got 31. Then he got a little over 63% in 2018, and now he's down to a little over 60%. Democrats have gone from 31 to 38 in these counties. Again, they're still losing these counties, but in terms of the trend of picking up vote share in the urban and suburban counties, you're definitely seeing that. Do you want to talk about the different types of suburbs at all, or just sort of wave at it?
I don't, I mean,
without numbers for a second?
I think if you have a couple good examples, I think that's fine.
I'll just say, if you look at, let's say, the suburbs, and one of the things that I would say is noticeable is that, the Houston suburbs and the Dallas-Fort Worth suburbs look a lot more like each other, which I think if you're familiar with the political geography of Texas should not be totally surprising. The Bexar County suburbs basically are rural parts of the state in most cases.
Yeah.
I mean, except for to the north, and that's kind of changing as we go, but pretty much everything around that is in the hill country, and it looks like that in terms of the trends.
Or you very rapidly get into sort of rural South Texas as you get to the southern edge of Bexar County.
And then when we look at the suburbs around Travis County, where Austin is, basically it's becoming more and more an extension of Austin in a lot of ways, just as an economic region, and then also in terms of the demographics and the way that voting looks. We can go into that in some other time talking about that, but that's how I would divide those up. So let me say, so where are Republicans doing well? Well, we can go into, let's look at the rural counties where the Republican firewalls have been. So the way we're defining that case is, okay, I talked about those urban counties. I talked about the suburban counties. I'm also adding in sort of other like large metro area, large-ish, super big metro areas, and leaving what's left. Most counties in Texas would fall into this rural definition. So in the way I have this, there's 57 non-rural counties, and the other two, out of the 254, the rest are rural.
Well, yeah.
So 197 or 198 counties left over that are rural. Okay. We had a whole podcast about this, I think. We were saying that Republicans regularly get about 75% of the vote share there. That's what Abbott got in 2014. In 2022, Mike Collier, Beto O'Rourke, they're in the rural areas. Greg Abbott, 79%. So he did a little bit better. And he did a little better than he did in 2018. So Republicans are doing better, or Greg Abbott is certainly doing better in these rural counties, from 75 to 77 to 79% of the vote share. But obviously, this is not a big part of the population. So if you're a Democrat, and you're kind of looking at this election and thinking, a lot of the questions right now is, should Beto O'Rourke ever run again? Are Democrats ever going to be able to win Texas? I would say you could look at these results from an electoral standpoint and say, well, actually, the trend lines of Democratic competitiveness increase in the urban areas and in the suburban areas are unbroken. Ultimately, it still resulted in an 11-point loss. But, I started this by saying, what do I think is a more comparable election? And I would say, I think 2014 and 2022 are more comparable to each other in a couple ways. And I think 2018 and 2022 are. And if you're a Democrat looking at these numbers and saying, okay, in 8 years, 2 full presidential election cycles, you've gone from losing at this top of the state level by more than 20 points to losing by about 10 points in elections that don't favor you. I think you would say that's actually, it feels slow in terms of the idea of like what people think about for progress. And when the question becomes, is Texas going to turn blue tomorrow? But in terms of what I think is realistic, this is still happening. This is still, the competitiveness is still increasing. I don't think Republicans are too worried about it at the moment. I don't think they necessarily should be, but
Well, I mean, we were talking about this beforehand. I mean, I think all of that is true, kind of consistent with what we had seen in polling, in election results before this election,
right.
in the trend, consistent with what we've been seeing in polling, right? In terms of what the favorability ratings look like in these three areas.
Yeah.
What all of the issue positions, even the trial ballots, looked pretty remarkable. If I had my act together, I'd have those trial ballots or some of that data in front of me. But, I mean, I think if we go back and look at the polling, unless I'm wrong, I mean, I don't think I'm going to be wrong enough that these are all within about 5 or 6 points of what we were seeing in the polling.
Yeah, I think that's about right.
More or less in terms of thinking about the trial ballots.
I'll look it up while you're thinking.
So on one hand, I think pretty consistent with what we've been seeing.
Mm-hmm.
Also, underlines something that we've been saying, and now that we've got one more data point, it's just one more, or one set of them for 1 year's elections worth, in terms of the singularity of 2018.
Right.
I think in the rest of the country, or at least in a lot of the more competitive states, certainly, what we're seeing is a lot of people seeing 2018 as kind of a kickoff of increased competitiveness and increased turnout. Now, some argument for that. For that argument here too, but in a much more diluted way, and from, as we say, here, at least once a week, from a very different baseline, right?
Right. Very important.
So I guess, as we interpret, what people think about this in terms of the arc of electoral competition in the state is getting more competitive, as we've told dozens of reporters over the last 2 election cycles, as we've written. But I mean, the slope of the curve here is so gradual. It's unmistakable. I mean, I think, the stuff you're looking at here and the way that it maps onto the geography.
Yeah, and I'll just say to your, something you
and the top line results.
Yeah, and if we include 2010 in this, which I think was a pretty crazy election too, you could look at this two ways. You could either further emphasize the trend, or it could even exaggerate it potentially. I mean, depending on how you think about 2010's impact on these things. But the Republican margins were even bigger in that election. So
yeah,
it would look even more stark if we went back a little bit further in this case.
Yeah, I mean, the 2010 and the 2022 comparisons are interesting because there's a lot of things you can hold equal.
Yeah.
Right. But the thing you can't is race.
Yeah. Well, that's another talk. That's a talk.
And that's, which is an interesting, piece of this. I mean, and you're kind of, Josh and I had a conversation or a chat or something offline this week. Very tentative, kind of off the top of my head suggestions about how we're periodizing this. And, what this tells us about the periodization of Texas politics. Again, lots of time for that later. But I guess what I'm really struck by here is, the difference between what we see analytically and in this, and in the immediate kind of, well, what does this tell us about partisan competition? And I think the answer, you're right, is clear. It's getting more competitive, but it also raises the question of when you have growing competition at such a gradual, if steady, but gradual rate, what is the response of the historical actors that are actually involved here?
Right.
Given the baseline that we're at.
And again, we're talking about statewide numbers versus a legislature that was, again, as we already said, kind of had a pretty easy night for the most part, right?
Yeah, and look, I mean, just to put it on the table, and this is something that, we've said on this podcast before, and I guess we have, sort of get out there, and I think we got at it. Was in a couple of things that we wrote, I think, in the last year, but I mean, I think what's interesting here is the idea that this pattern has now been in place for so long, even allowing for, the last almost decade of, a shift in back towards more democratic competitiveness. The Republicans have had a lot of time to react and to use the advantages that they have structurally and institutionally to respond to that.
Yeah, and
now they can only, people make history, but not in conditions of their choosing, as the guy said. But and I think that does bring us to some of the tactical adjustments, tactical and strategic adjustments that we've seen Republicans making in the last couple cycles. One of them is driving up the rural vote.
Absolutely. Right.
Right. I mean, I don't know that it had any effect, but, there was a lot of, a little bit of, I shouldn't say a lot. There were some corners people were snickering about, the lieutenant governor's bus tour in rural areas that was not covered by the press. Now, I think given that we're seeing this trend, I wouldn't give that actual bus tour, all this credit in terms of driving up rural turnout. But it was certainly not, the worst idea.
Well, as
as it turns out,
we've been talking, probably not for half an hour yet. I should just throw, it was probably endogenous.
Right.
Right.
Well,
Ultimately, yes. I mean, it probably didn't have a huge.
The strategy was not lost on the lieutenant governor and his advisors.
Exactly.
Right?
Well, again, they're looking at the same things that we're looking at. I mean, to some extent, if you don't know what turnout's going to look like in the city, you don't know how the election is going to be administered or how well it's going to be administered, how well it's going to be administered everywhere, which was not a non-issue. This election cycle, your unknown is turnout. I mean, that was all of our unknowns on this one. Nobody, I mean, there are a lot of people who predicted turnout levels of various things that had to revise them once early voting starting basically immediately. And that's not to say anybody was wrong, because it was impossible to know. And so, to give, how I like to be fair. But I mean, to the extent that the lieutenant governor in that period, especially before early voting, was putting out the signal that it might, either that it was closer or it might be closer. Look, there's a very clear strategic reason to do that as just an actor. Let's just,
Right.
But if you don't know where, there's a lot of people who live in an area, they lean heavily Democratic, and you don't know what their turnout is going to look like. It makes a lot of sense to shore up your support where that you're basically almost 100% of the people you interact with are going to be your people.
And the prevalent and plausible interpretation of the most recent midterm experience was that the rural areas saved them in 2018.
Rural firewall was the term.
Right.
Of
and
art.
So, I think, a little bit of credit's not exactly right, but I mean, I think, I thought a lot of the coverage of that, really reflected the press feeling excluded from it because they weren't cooperative with the press.
Yeah, because they were.
And that, I think that led people in the wrong direction in terms of thinking about the strategy and how they covered it. So the other tactical thing is something you've been looking at a lot, and that's, the Republican push on Hispanics, particularly in the RGV, which has gotten a ton of print, a ton of discussion in here. And you've kind of unpacked a lot of those numbers in a way that does reveal the degree to which that's a part of this puzzle with, mixed results, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. There's something that I think we're gonna have to unpack this, again and again, unfortunately, probably. Well, not unfortunately, it's pretty interesting, actually. But, what's sort of striking to me is there's a tendency in analysis of, Hispanic voting patterns in Texas. And I want to say here, I'm not talking about Hispanic voting patterns nationally.
Yeah.
I want to set that aside. We're just talking about Texas. But there's a tendency to sort of, say, well, let's talk about this region or let's talk about these counties. It's like, okay, well, now let's talk about these congressional districts. And it's like, these are different areas, right? And in any sense, none of them are perfect measurements of Hispanics or even Hispanics voting in those areas because we just don't have that kind of data. But but the thing is, whereas the congressional district lines shifted as they did, and that's important, right? I mean, everybody who was, sort of, if anyone was surprised by Vicente Gonzalez's win, right, over Mayra Flores, Mayra Flores won that seat in a special election under the old district lines,
right,
which was a marginally Democratic district
with amazingly low turnout,
and a ton of resources. The district was redrawn to be plus 16 Democratic. There's no reason to suppose that she was going to win that district.
Right.
Right. And so, part of this is just to say, if Gonzalez had lost that district, Democrats were losing everywhere. They were losing everything. The House was going to be a bloodbath, and they didn't. And ultimately, all of this talk and all of this attention, really what they did was two things. Is they made CD 34 a safer Democratic district. They actually made Henry Cuellar's district slightly safer so that they could have access to CD 15, which they won. And the other thing I'll say is they also shored up CD 23, which we used to talk about a lot. And now we kind of just don't, but we would say now it's basically a Republican district.
For listeners that are not, that are only partially dorky, that's that huge district, used to, a lot of familiar names that goes from the outskirts of San Antonio into El Paso.
Right. So, you look at that, and so in part is just there's a lot of different ways to look at this, and you can't treat them all the same, but but some people are saying, well, Republicans put this huge push into South Texas, and they netted one congressional seat, it's like, well, okay, but also that CD15, they say,
kind of better than zero.
Well, better than zero, but also just now to get to the point of the Hispanic vote, this was a district that was often referred to by Republicans as a border district. Now, if you know what that district looks like, it's basically like a finger. It starts down in Hidalgo County on the border and then shoots up to basically east of San Antonio. And if you remember, we were talking about what do the outskirts of San Antonio look like? They look like rural Texas, where, again, if you look at the county level results in those counties, 70, 80% Republican.
In areas where there is a high percentage of Hispanics in the population.
Yeah. So,
but also thinly populated.
Right.
Because rural.
Right. Exactly. So anyway, it's easy to kind of overinterpret this in either direction, but then we go and we kind of look at the RGV because that's been so much of the focus. Now, let's look at these counties. This is a fixed area. And what do we find? Well, there were 233,000 votes cast in the RGV in this election. That represented 2.88% of the total votes cast in the state, which I think is something, again, if we're going to focus on this region, we got to be careful. Democrats won the region by about 36,000 votes. In terms of percentage, they won it by about 15.28%. In 2020, they won it by 15.14%.
Right.
Okay. Now, look, this is a big drop off from where they were before. In 2018, they were winning it by 35 points. So look, it's not to say that they haven't, they aren't having an issue here, but this is still a region that they're winning. And honestly, despite all of the attention paid to the region, Republicans didn't really make a big push here relative to 2020 in terms of their overall numbers at the top of the ticket.
And if you look at that time series you put together, even, it includes presidential elections, but there's a decent amount of variance in those results, even prior to 2020.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. Yeah, there's definitely a decent amount of variance. But the other side of it I would just sort of point out is, yes, Democrats did less well there than they did in 2018. They lost about 30,000 votes. Republicans gained about 17,000 votes. But it kind of, just to make a point here, we're talking about, again, 2.88% of the electorate.
Yeah.
We're talking about 17,000 votes. How much money and ink has been spilled on this?
Right.
I know someone later will do a calculation of like dollars per vote gain kind of thing. And I'm very curious to see what it is.
There's a couple floating around out there in some, different races. But yeah, here I think it's going to be very interesting.
Well, and so then we say like, okay, look, let's just take a step back further and say, okay, we're looking at this one region of the state, which I think, you and I have argued, and I've argued like aggressively in some places, is probably not representative of Hispanics living in the state. Well, why don't we go look at the exit polling? Now, look, there's all kinds of problems with exit polling.
Right.
But it's a consistent source of information that we can at least, look at for something. Now, I'd say this, in most cases, most people who have a problem with the exit polling, especially has it characterized as Hispanics, would say that it characterizes them as too conservative. Let's just look at it for a second as an example of statewide sentiment, right? Because we can look at our polling and we know that the Hispanic sentiment hasn't changed that much, except really in rural areas. But if we look at this, we say, the one big number that shocked a lot of people, when Abbott beat Wendy Davis in 2014, the exit polling had him getting 44% of the Hispanic vote to Davis.
There was an enormous amount of pushback on that number.
Enormous amount of pushback. In 2020, again, we're talking about, Republican gains. It was 58% Democrat, 40% Republican, and again, in the exit polling.
And that was the presidential election.
The presidential, that's plus 18. And in 2022, it's 57% Democrat, 40% Republican, so plus 17. So again, definitely a decline from what we were seeing in terms of Democratic gains in 2016 and 2018. Not as well as Abbott performed in 2014, and about the same as 2020. So in terms of this big picture about, planting a flag in South Texas and the push among Hispanics, it's not overwhelming in the data.
Right.
By any stretch. And part of it is it was kind of, we've been kind of talking about this for a while. It was hard to expect it to be because we were talking about such a very narrow region and letting it stand as representative. But there's kind of little evidence at this point that, Abbott certainly did not win a majority of Hispanics. We know that, as he claimed he was going to at the beginning of the election. And if anything, if you go on to go by the measures that, they were pretty happy to tout when he won 44%, he actually did worse than in 2014.
But if we, but the reason, we slot this in at this time is if we're talking about the Republican strategy of responding to this overall trend, to repeat the point that, we've made a million times on now, and I feel almost embarrassed to repeat it again, but Republicans winning between a third and 40% of the Hispanic vote in Texas is not news.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Like, yes.
Kind of the bottom line. I mean, I feel almost, silly elaborating this yet again.
Right.
But, to the extent that you're talking about deflecting these overall trends, you're finding, little pockets of votes. It's part of the Republican strategy that then is embedded in the larger strategy, also implied in your, sort of use of CD34 and of the redrawing of 14,
no.
15.
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, they're all redrawn.
Yeah, but the radical redrawing to benefit Republicans, that's all of a piece.
Right.
Right. And it's all of a piece of what's going on. I kind of envision, we look at these trend lines and we're looking at them getting more democratic, but then there's all this kind of maelstrom going on around those lines that, is the context of this. And I think, we saw that and something we haven't mentioned this time, but also voting rules. Right. And so there's a lot of things that you can do when you have institutional leverage if you recognize what these trends are. And I think that at least the consulting class and, people that think more strategically in the Republican Party, I think they have a pretty clear view of this.
Yeah. I mean, look,
a lot of them, like some people don't care and are certainly pushing in the opposite direction and interpret this as, we haven't gotten to, we probably won't today. The issue of, as we go into the legislative session, into the, the beating heart of the process, the beating heart of the political economy in the state in a lot of ways, how are governing Republicans going to interpret these results?
Right. Yeah. And I mean,
what if you win by this much, that the psychology of people is going to be that they feel like they have a mandate. But what is that mandate, and how do you balance the different pieces of that? And that's obviously a whole other. But I mean, I think you have to kind of keep all this in mind as you move into that space, because it's going to affect how people strategize, what their priorities are.
As what's great about covering Texas politics is that once you get sick of elections, the legislature starts, and then once you get sick of the legislature, we go back to elections, and so we have these 2-year back and forth. But this is the part of the year where we start to shift our discussion to the topic of agenda control and agenda management, right? And really now that the election is over, the next step is, there's all these sorts of little things that are, kind of important to the consultant class, especially around elections and politics. We've been talking about those. But at this point, the question was, okay, this is now just an input.
Right.
This just becomes one more input into what becomes a fight over what the agenda is going to be. And
a highly mediated input.
Right.
Right. Which is, different people find different things interesting. I think this moment is, it's going to be very interesting. And one of the quotes from I'm not sure if it was from Governor Abbott's speech or from a post-election interview, but the quote was, here are the priorities that, it might even have been a paraphrase, but the order of the priorities that Governor Abbott announced as going into the legislature were job growth, property tax reduction, school choice, and improving border security.
Yeah, it's
and that is a bucket of slightly rearranged campaign priorities.
Yeah,
just thinking strictly in terms of rank order.
Yeah, absolutely.
And gives you the stuff of some of the bargaining we anticipate going on.
Yeah.
When you look at all of those things being included in a kind of marquee manner.
Absolutely.
All right, Josh, thanks for digging all that data out.
Yeah.
Terrific.
Well, I gotta say, I love it. I was dorking out this morning. Part of the election, I'm like, oh God, I can't stand this. Can it just be over? I was like, we were talking on election day. I took the kids to the park. I'm like, God, just let's get this going, be done with it. But then once I actually have data, it's so much more fun. Because at least you can go. You don't have to speculate anymore. Let's just see what happens.
Well, more specifically, you have election returns.
Yeah.
We're not having to say things and then go, well, and remember, that's an estimate. And
Yeah, no, this is just, let's just see what happened. And now we get to look at it, and it's interesting. And there's still more. I mean, it'll be interesting to dig out like precinct level returns in some of those congressional districts in the RGV. Where did Republicans actually make those gains relative to the discussion?
Yeah, I'm very interested in looking at some of those precinct level returns in the Cuellar race. And, we haven't really done it. There's a certain amount of there haven't been that many. I guess there won't be that many to do, but we talked a lot about that Cuellar race. We talked a lot about it in the primary. We talked about it less so, but still was on a lot of lists in the general election. And Representative Cuellar is back. Congressman Cuellar is back.
Well, the thing is, just to this kind of finish this out for Democrats, kind of thinking about what's next based on the results in that region. What you notice is your moderate to kind of conservative Hispanic Texas Democrats got reelected, and the progressive,
little more uneven, shall we say?
Yeah. And again, it's not to say that's true. Greg Kazar won his district, a very progressive Democrat going to Washington. It doesn't mean that's
you don't want to overgeneralize.
But again, I never want to overgeneralize beyond the RGV and beyond the border region, because it's a different place.
Well, and as we go into as we get set, as you say, to go into the kind of next phase, there's that, in terms of the culture of working in this business and in this area, we're now in the, election to legislative transition phase.
Right.
And then we'll get into the legislature phase. Soon we'll be pretty deep in the legislative phase, but I think, probably, as we hurtle towards the holidays, we'll probably have a little bit of anticipation of what's going on in the legislature coming up and what that looks like. But I think, as I talked to different groups and, talked to a group this morning, it is interesting to see people digest what is going on here as actors begin to move into the arena of the legislature and see the replication of a lot of the conflicts that we've talked about being sort of submerged when you get into the general election environment. Now reemerging, mapped onto the legislative process and governing, right? And the governing part now is going to be, I think, very interesting. I was talking this morning a lot about, how this feeds the institutional questions that we were talking about a lot before we sort of moved into full election mode. You've got a very strong governor who has strengthened the executive branch, now winning again by an 11-point margin. You have a very powerful lieutenant governor who has won by, just a little less than that, and is now moving in with a Senate that he helped craft even further and has already been, fairly pliable, shall we say.
Well, it's interesting. And he's also on his way out by his own.
Well, his
own statement, which normally I would say under normal circumstances, you might say, well, maybe that kind of weakens him. I don't know that that's the case in this scenario.
Well, and I think there are a lot of scenarios playing out right now that suggest that he would be aware of that, and that there are possible strategies that he can take.
I'd imagine so.
to make that less so. I think we'll leave that for another podcast. Though it is interesting, and I strongly suspect we will have a lot of opportunity to talk about that in the new year, if not slightly before. So thank you, Josh, for being here and for all the work on that. Thanks to our excellent production team in the Dev Studio and the College of Liberal Arts here at the University of Texas at Austin. Remember, you can find some of the data we talked about today. We'll probably try to process some of this in the next couple weeks and put it in a post. Watch our email for that. You can sign up for our email list on our website. All of this at texaspolitics.utexas.edu. Thanks for listening, and we'll be back soon with another Second Reading podcast. The Second Reading podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.